Okay, so tonight's topic is about evolution. We began the series about the 70 most difficult questions in Judaism. As I pointed out, there may be more questions. You're welcome to bring up questions, and maybe we'll discuss them later on. 70 difficult questions, 70 important questions. And it's important to go through them to have an understanding of them, because these are issues that may have bothered some of us, that may be on our minds. And it's not a good idea to live in doubt, to live with questions in our mind. And all of us have questions from time to time. It's important to find the answers, and Judaism has the answers to most questions, even though not all questions can be answered easily. But nevertheless, there's quite a bit of information in the Talmud, in the Zohar, in the Midrashim, in the Kabbalah, that addresses, just about any issue that we can come up with. I began the series with creation. We showed several videos, which I think their impact is very strong, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And the various videos showed design, showed order, showed harmony, and the last video showed intelligence. Marabu ma'asech Hashem kulam bechokhmah asita. If one just looks to everything that is in this world, in the universe, one is able to see the great design and the intelligence that is in everything. Nevertheless, we want to be fair. We want to try to figure out and understand, why doesn't everybody believe? What is the other side claiming? And as I pointed out, there's only two ideas. Either you believe in creation, right? Or you believe that everything came about by itself. And that's what tonight's topic is about, is trying to understand how people really believe, or I shouldn't say people, even intelligent scientists, how could they make this claim that everything came about by itself? Now, evolution, which is what we're going to be speaking about tonight, is really something that existed, the theory of it. The idea of evolution existed throughout history. It's not something completely brand new. There were certain ideas that were expressed in the past, even by the Greeks, that come close to this theory of evolution. Most of you who have read about evolution or have heard about evolution, you are probably associating evolution with Darwinism. And that is correct, because he's the one that published a book about it. And after his book was published, it spread like wildfire. It caught on. And those who came after him expounded further on it, elaborated it, and tried to prove this theory, even though he himself, if we can call him the founder of this theory, had his own doubts about it. As we will see later on, he was not 100% convinced of this, even though he very much believed in it. He had some doubts. What is the theory of evolution? The theory of evolution, plainly said, believes in the gradual development of species, of cells, of organisms, the gradual, over time, over millions of years perhaps. After all, they claim that given enough time, anything can happen. How did it all begin? Well, there's different theories to that. There's the famous theory of the Big Bang. There was a big explosion. And that is how matter first originated, and it further developed. Before we go on, I just want to introduce you to some concepts. In talking about evolution, there's something called macroevolution and something called microevolution. Macro means big. Big evolution. In other words, we went from the smallest organisms, the simplest organisms, into very intelligent beings. That is a big macroevolution. Microevolution is gradual small changes that occur that actually we have no problem with, as you will see. The problem is with the big macroevolution. And as I said before, there were similar ideas of how this came about. We don't have the time to go through this whole science, through this whole theory, and I'm going to try to just give you a synopsis of the research that was done, the problems with it, and the psychology behind the people that very much believe in this. We have to understand what we're dealing with over here. To us it may be simple, either because we grew up with it, with creation, in other words, with that idea in our mind, or because we're very logical and we don't have to think of something else that doesn't make as much sense. But for some people, it's the only thing they believe in. They don't want to hear about anything else. Rabbis tell us, and this is a fact, even though not all scientists will agree with this, but it is documented in our sources, that there is something called microevolution. Microevolution says that depending where you live, you will acquire certain characteristics because of the climate, because of the food, because of the environment. After all, how did the Chinese, Korean, Japanese get slanted eyes? Hashem did not create Adam HaRishon with slanted eyes, I assure you. Why is the color of Scandinavians blonde hair, and the color of others is black, and we have brown, we have red, we have curly hair, we have tall, we have small people, we have all kinds of human beings. They're all human, by the way. We all have a lot in common, just about everything is in common, but there's certain physiological differences, color of the eyes, etc. These are minor changes that can happen. We can call them we can even call it microevolution. And then what does that depend on? Depends on the environment. Believe it or not, if you were to move today to China, I can almost guarantee it. I don't know about you or your children, but eventually your great-grandchildren will look Chinese. They will have slanted eyes. Because that is how the first peoples who inhabited that part of the world became like that. Because the environment, rabbis tell us, definitely has an influence on how one looks. And you can test me. You can bring here a group of 10 Jews. One from Russia, one from Yemen, one from Morocco, one from Israel, one from Iran, from India, from Europe, from Germany, and I will tell you without speaking to them where each one was born. As long as he, his father and grandfather, at least several generations, were there. How do I know? Only because I've seen and I've been exposed to a lot of people. How do I know if somebody's from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Honduras, Mexico, Argentina? Just by looking at them, not even hearing their Spanish. Because once you hear the Spanish, the dialect, the accent, that's a giveaway. But even by looking at them, because there's different kinds of groups in these countries. Even though many of them have mixed Spanish blood from the Spaniards, we're talking about Aztec Indians, Zapotec Indians, Mayan Indians, Incas. And if you ever become familiar with the features of each one of these Indians, and you see that mixture in an individual, you say, well, there's no Maya in Mexico unless you go maybe to the very south. There is some. Mexican Indians are not from that stock. You won't see Inca Indians in Mexico. So when you see, some of them are very hard to figure out. Some of them are all, dark is dark. But there are clear features that if you get used to these features, you can figure out. If I see a Russian Jew, I can tell you if he's Russian or if he's Ukrainian. That even Russians don't always know that. Because you have to get used to it and be sensitive to it. There's definitely a difference between a Yemenite Jew and a European Jew. I think most of you can tell that. Right? Could you tell the difference between somebody from Egypt and somebody from Morocco by looking at them? If somebody told you saw two Jews, one of them is Egyptian, could you tell by looking at them which one it is without hearing the Arabic? I could. Right? The Egyptians are always smiling.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, there's obviously differences, but we're not always used to them, and we don't observe them unless the differences are very, very striking, unless they stand out, then you know what it is. So anyway, we believe in this microevolution, right? But we don't believe in the macroevolution. that macroevolution means that species would develop into being something completely different kind, that's too fantastic and too unbelievable for that to happen. And as I will explain later on what the problem scientifically with this is. Now, I just said something logically, but scientifically it does not make sense either. This evolution, this theory of evolution, had various variations in the past. What this, I guess, philosophy or this thinking had in common all along was a lack of divine supreme being directing all of this. There are some that believe that we came all from air, from water, that water or air is the origin of everything. There are some that believe that it was through breeding that all these changes occurred. There's all kinds of varieties within this theory of explaining the various species, how they came about. But what they have in common is that there is a lack of God in all these theories. They don't agree that there was a supreme being that existed all along forever that brought this about, that we call creation. So this has existed throughout the past history until when? Until Christianity and Islam came about. Now when Christianity and Islam came about, they didn't just try to teach and convince, they actually forced many people to accept their belief that there is a God, that there is a creator, which is something very interesting, which is a topic for another time, as to how come these religions all of a sudden developed, and it turns out it happened right after the destruction of the Second Temple. It's not a coincidence that the world is turning to monotheism, which in the very beginning, this is what Avraham Avinu was preaching. And actually all along, I've said this many times, all along, the majority of the people, and most of the cultures, even though I said there was some evolutionary thinking, the majority of the people, even who were pagan, of the Avodah Zarah, they did believe in a creator. So that was really the more accepted philosophy or understanding of how the world came about, that there was some supreme being. If you go to the Indians, if you read through their history, you will find all sorts of ideas that perhaps point at the evolutionary way of thinking, but nevertheless, many of them, perhaps the majority of them, did believe in a supreme being, some entity out there, even though they may have given it different names. As you know, with Christianity, they went as far as to try to stamp out any other belief. That is why we, the Jews, suffered also from them, even though we believe too in God. But it was their religion and their faith that they wanted to introduce, that they wanted to force upon us. Which, by the way, I just thought about it. Perhaps, today that is what's happening in a different way. Evolutionary people who believe in evolution, evolutionists, are trying to impose this doctrine on us, or at least on public schools where they have some control, where they don't want anything else to be taught except for evolution. This has become the religion of the time. This is what they're trying to impose as the only true way of explaining how creation came about. Just like the Christians try to impose through force that this is the only belief that you should accept and nothing else is valid. Now, the question we have to deal with right now is our time, our history. For the past 160 years or so, ever since Darwin's book was published, there appears to have been a change in the way people think. All along, throughout history, they believed one thing. So what exactly happened that made people change their minds? How did evolution come about? It doesn't just happen overnight that people started believing in this new idea. By the way, it only caught on really recently when they put it into the science books in the early 1960s. I don't know if you know this, but before then, even though it was something spoken about in the scientific community, in the actual textbooks, from what I recall, it was only in the early 60s, and ever since it's like a given. They're trying to prove it, trying to find more evidence to it. Before then, it wasn't so known, even though it was spoken about. So what exactly happened in the 1800s? What led people to embrace this religion, I like to call it? After all, they also believe. They are believing in something. There's no real proof to it. They claim there's a lot of evidence, which we're going to take apart tonight. But it's more of a belief. They want to believe in something which cannot really be proven. So why did this happen? In the early 1800s, there was the Industrial Revolution. As you know, as the Zohar says, in the year 1840, the Zohar says clearly, in the year 1840, the gates of wisdom will open up. And if you look back to the history of the 19th century, the gates of wisdom did open up because that is when major discoveries were found. Inventions, discoveries, up to now. Incredible advances in technology unseen before. The world did not progress too much over time. I mean, they found the wheel, the printing press, the telescope, eyeglasses, all sorts of little inventions, small inventions that did not make life that much different as it was. Life was very similar in the 1500s as it was in the 1100s. 400 years, you didn't see, perhaps the dress code changed. I mean, very few things. All of a sudden in the 19th century you have a tremendous revolution, especially once they found electricity. Electricity opened up the door to everything, just about. But we're talking about advances in the medical field, the knowledge of the anatomy of the human body, a better understanding of what we have here on Earth and in outer space, computers, I mean, you name it. Cell phones, I mean, who would think of cell phones? You can talk from here to Israel on something which is wireless. I mean, even if it was wired, it was a big thing. Airplanes, life has changed dramatically. So what do we have here? We have here science. Science becoming a dominant factor in people's life, because science is the one that's getting the credit for all these advances. So they're getting a lot of brownie points, I guess they would call it in English. Science is becoming very important, becoming very significant. And what is this doing? This is an outlet. Science is becoming also an outlet to get away from the church. What did we say about the church just before? They were powerful, a powerful body that imposed its doctrine on its own people and on others. They had a tremendous amount of power, the church. Much more than they have today. Much more. People were actually afraid of the church. The Inquisition for the Jews, I mean, that was all the church. So here you have science developing, just like they claim evolution is something that's developing. So did the science develop, and the theory of evolution developed with it. And people started believing what science has to say. And what did we just say? It was also an outlet from the church to get away from religious practice. It's not a coincidence. No coincidence whatsoever that in the 20th and 21st century we have so many dropouts, if we can call that, from religion amongst the Jews and amongst the non-Jews. Dropouts. You never had something like this in the past. Dropouts of Judaism you did have, a few, but they were the minority, not the majority. Such assimilation today, lack of strong attachment to one's tradition. Why? It's a combination of factors, but one of them being because of the Industrial Revolution, the importance of science, and then you have, of course, Noat HaSkala, the Enlightenment of the 17th, 18th century, I guess, where you had the various philosophers, the various teachings, just the various movements and way of thinking. And people are affected by the environment, as we said before, physiologically, and also mentally, by what they hear and what they read, the teachers one has, the friends one has, and where you live. You are affected by what you hear and what you see. It's hard to immunize yourself unless one is attached to the Torah. So you have Jews being affected by all these streams, all these ways of thinking, and some of them were atheistic in nature, contrary to everything that is written in the Torah. But if you don't have strong roots if you now don't have a true love and attachment for your faith, for your people, anything is possible. Anything is possible. But we still have to understand, and I'm going to explain it towards the end, what made people embrace this more than what was common sense. Common sense. The belief in God, the belief in creation. And the big question too applies to those who already had that belief and abandoned it, which you have it today too. Unfortunately, in Israel today, well, fortunately, we have a concept called Chozrim B'Tshuva, those who have come back. Then you have, unfortunately, very sadly, Chozrim B'She'elah, those who have returned or gone away because of questions in their minds. In other words, they were religious, they were observant, they grew up in homes of rabbis, and they've abandoned everything. It's sad, it happens, it has happened before, it can happen all the time, and we're going to explain a little bit why it happens later on. So we have like this, we have the factors contributing to the evolution. Number one, the science or the Industrial Revolution, which also includes getting away from the church. We have the factor of the various philosophies, the Enlightenment, and one can add the innocent discoveries of some scientists. Innocent, what I mean by innocent is giluyim tmimim. In other words, that they discovered certain things which gave them a flash, gave them some ideas. After all, how do you think Darwin started this whole idea? It was through an observation. He was on a tour of the Galapagos Islands. Islands that are off the coast of Ecuador in South America. I think they're about 600 miles off the coast. Somewhat remote. And if you go there too, you will find all sorts of species that you won't find anywhere else. And he saw some birds. And he noticed that they adapted to the environment. They developed a little bit differently. So everybody says, you see, adaptation to the environment, and adaptation will bring about more and more change over time. Give it enough time, everything is possible. But wait a minute, what did we say before? We have no problem with microevolution. Adapting, of course. You want your kids to look Chinese, you go to China and you will adapt to the Chinese environment. You go to India, especially to the southern part of India, and over time, you become darker. Same thing in Yemen. The skin will become darker. Now, a white man will not become a black man, but darker, yes. Why won't white become black? Perhaps another time I'll explain that. On how that originated is a story in itself, how the black race originated. But it does not happen because of evolution, and that will not happen either because of environment. Dark skin, yes. Darker skin, yes. Curly hair, yes. All these things, yes. But not macro evolution of something becoming something else completely. So these discoveries, nevertheless, of some species adapting, eventually, together with all the other factors, led them to the blind belief that we call evolution, that everything evolved. And how did it evolve? Through something called survival of those who have the better qualities, or as they call it in English, survival of the fittest. Because you have a lot of changes. Not all the changes remain, even though there's adaptation. Through natural and gradual development, certain species remained and certain species became extinct. The best ones remained, and they eventually further developed based on the environment and based on whatever circumstances brought about the change. And before you know it, you have a monkey becoming a human being. Before you know it, right? And it all started from cells, from other primitive organisms, and little by little, all this change, macro. Now, they themselves realized that there's some problems with this. They realized that you cannot just take something and over time have it become something completely different. They realized that there was a weakness with this theory by itself. You had to add something else to the theory to make it more sensible. So they added the idea of mutations. So here you have macroevolution or survival of the fittest, not strong enough of an argument of producing major changes, even though it's gradual, it's too extreme. So there has to be a mechanism that will allow for the changes. And after all, just by itself, changes by themselves, changes just don't happen by themselves. So they introduce mutations. Does everybody here know what the word mutations is? A mutation is a change that is abnormal. An abnormal change. An abnormal change is when you have two people who are dark in every respect, black hair, dark skin, and their child all of a sudden is completely white. White hair, white skin, everything. And it's not in the genes. It's nowhere to be found in the genes. No grandfather, no great mother, nothing. It's something mutant. Something mutant, some abnormal change that happened in a gene. And these things can happen for all sorts of reasons. Deformities exist. As you know, deformities exist throughout the species. Even in the animals, they have found, you find sometimes snakes with two heads. That is something. I mean, even though everything is min hashamayim, Hashem put in the nature certain possibilities for whatever reason. There's a reason for everything. We don't know the reason, but the reason, they call that mutations. So in order for them to make this theory of evolution more palatable, they should be more accepted, they said that through mutations, eventually everything was possible. Through all the changes, everything came about, and eventually those, as I said before, that were the most fitting, they are the ones that survived. Another very important contributor, perhaps, to this theory, there are actually two more contributors that very much strengthen the theory. What led to the strengthening of the theory of evolution was science as a whole, but what part of science? Anybody know what part of science really gave a lot of credence to this theory? Geology and heredity. Remember Mr. Mendel? Mendel's law of how the genes are inherited, how they go over. You studied biology, I'm sure you came across this. How certain genes go from the father, some from the mother, certain ones are retained, certain ones are dormant.
Dominant recessive.
Dominant recessive, right? Remember that, right? Yeah. So that was a very important discovery. It was a discovery. And even though it wasn't intended immediately to serve evolution, and it doesn't really serve evolution, it makes us understand certain things, and it is a fact. I mean, we know that certain genes are transferred over, but nevertheless, it led more credence to evolution because, after all, if things go over, genes go over, they adapt, they change, they're retained, transferred over, it definitely gave more strength to the theory over time. The certain characteristics perhaps are acquired through inheritance and so forth. Even though, by the way, they tried to cut off a mouse, the tail of a mouse, with the belief. This was one thinking, with the belief that the progeny will be born without tails. And of course, they were disappointed when the new mice were born with tails. You know why? Because they didn't know something called DNA that we know today. The DNA, the blueprint of everything, is there. You cut off a finger of a mother, will her child be born without a finger? Chas v'shalom. What does one thing have to do with another? But this whole way of thinking led them to believe all sorts of things, that it would be possible. They tried and they failed. Nevertheless, they still believe in certain things. So you have this heredity thing, genes. Then you have geology. Now the geology is very fascinating. Geology was a pretty much relatively new science. The study of the strata, the rock strata, minerals, and so forth. A lot of branches to geology. But basically the way the geology worked was as follows. Geologists attempted to define the age of the earth. How? By making all sorts of discovery in the strata, the rock strata. Rock strata means the layers of rocks. Now, you look all over the world, you won't find too many layers, major layers, in rock. You will find it in the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is a good example of various layers, but otherwise you have to go all over the world to see different kinds of layers. And they found all sorts of fossils. Does everybody here know what a fossil is? Remnants, whether it's the actual skeleton or whether it's the actual imprint of an animal or a plant that was there before. And that imprint is usually mineralized. So there's something left there, so you could see it. And that is how they, attempt to figure out many things. Well, let's see, where was it found? In what rock and in what layer of the strata? And depending on where they found it, they say this one is millions of years old, this one is a few thousand years old. And therefore, what this geology did back then, in conjunction with evolution, is, the world was not created in 6 days. That was an immediate challenge to the church, or to monotheism, or to Judaism, that we believe in that Hashem created the world in 6 days. No, it couldn't be, because you need millions of years to produce this evolution, to produce all these changes. You need millions of years to bring about all these organisms, and we find all of these rock strata, and they're millions of years apart. Why are they millions of years apart? Because they've made a decision. The human beings did not live together with dinosaurs, and therefore wherever you find a dinosaur, it must be 10 million years old, and if you find a human being, he must be only a few thousand years old. This is how they determined the age of the strata. But there was a circular logic here, circular way of thinking here. And what was the circular way of thinking? I will determine the age of the organism by where it was found in the rock strata. That is how I will determine the age of the organism. And I will determine the age of the rock or of the layer based on what animal I find there. Well, you have to make up your mind. How are you going to figure out the other? You can't do it. You can't have it both ways. So anyway, the big chachamim, I call them chachamim, of today, Jewish chachamim, and I don't mean rabbis, I mean chachamim, they think they're smart. They're Jewish scientists. They say, no, don't worry, there's no contradiction between evolution and Judaism. We can explain 6 days as every day being a million years. After all, whoever told you that every single day was 24 hours? We'll talk about that either next week or in 2 weeks from now. When we talk about the topic of how old is the world, what methods have they used to figure out the age of the world, what's wrong with their methods, and how do we know that every day of the week was in fact 24 hours? Even though, I'm preparing you right now, there is an opinion that every day was 1,000 years. Yes?
How is the Ibra Hazar?
Yeah. Bonei Olamot Umachrivan is mentioned in the Zohar, and that has to do with spiritual worlds. HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates a world and destroys them, has nothing to do with the physical world that we live in. The Kabbalah says so very clearly. We're talking about Olamot Ruchaniot, Lo Ha'olam Shelano. But people took that ma'amar and they said, here, it says Hashem created many worlds and destroyed them. Mapitomi, it's spiritual worlds. And whoever knows the concept in Kabbalah, which we spoke about, Shvirat HaKelim, has a little bit of an understanding what it means L'achriv Olam. So it has nothing to do with our world. Yes?
I just have a question as to your premise, where you talk about how certain scientists believe that the world is a certain age because of the fossils that they find in the rock strata.
Right.
But isn't also radioactivity
Right.
used, and there's a certain measurable life to...
Right, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about carbon-14 dating. That is one of the methods that we'll talk about when we talk about the age of the Earth and what the problems or weaknesses with that most accurate scientific method. Nevertheless, it has weaknesses because it makes certain assumptions. The problem is always with certain assumptions. When you can't prove something 100% and you have to make assumptions, then you're running a risk of being wrong. So we'll talk about that in a week or two from now. Okay, so I gave you a little bit of an introduction. We spoke about how this philosophy or way of thinking came about. And now let's talk about the weaknesses of evolution, of why there's a problem. Scientifical. I'm going to talk about scientifically what the problems is. We don't have the time to go through all the weaknesses, and there are a lot of problems with it. There's tons of material all over the place about this. And it's just a fascinating... it's fascinating to see how the two sides argue, those who believe in creation versus those who believe in evolution. But here are some obvious problems. Problem number one. We talked about the fossils, right, being found in the geological rock strata. Evolution claims it makes a very important claim that everything gradually changed, right? In other words, eventually, a monkey became a man. Well, since many fossils were found all over the world, and almost anywhere you go you'll find fossils, how come we haven't found one fossil anywhere that is the missing link between the ape and man? Nobody has ever found. They've tried. You know that they've even resorted to a hoax. Does everybody here understand what a hoax is? A joke? A trick? There was something called Piltdown Man. The Piltdown Man. They found the jaw of a monkey and the skull of a human being together. The jaw was of a monkey. I mean, the scientists know what they're talking about. When they see a monkey, they know it's a monkey. So, I mean, there's no problem with that. The skull of a human being, they know it's the skull of a human being. And they found it together. Ooh, this made a tremendous big rash, commotion in the scientific community. 500 books, approximately, were written about the Piltdown Man. 500 books. For 45 years, they talked about it. And guess what happened after 45 years? They found it was a hoax. Somebody took the jawbone of a monkey, literally, and combined it with a human skull. Here, I found something. You see what they resort to? A big hoax. 500 books were written on this, and all of a sudden they realized it was a sheker, complete lie. They have never found, and even if they tell you, and they will tell you, some of the very intelligent scientists with PhDs will tell you, of course we found them. Don't believe all these creationists. Of course there are many founds. Many. All over the place. They're just all over the world. Just waiting to be found. Links. If you really narrow them down, they will tell you, well, these are small changes. Small changes, what did we say before, is not a problem. Small changes within a species is possible. But not that one species becomes another species, that a fish became an amphibian became a reptile became a human being. Yes?
I'm not an expert in evolution.
Baruch Hashem. Yeah.
But did they find bones that they put together, they fit into categories like Neanderthal and other things?
Yeah, you will find changes within a species. Always. As I said before, and I mentioned the Gemara talks about people being different depending on where they grew up, differences in skulls. Even the biologists, the ones who have an open mind, have demonstrated how Europeans who have come to the United States, their kids were born with a more oval skull, whereas the Europeans have more of a square skull. Well, how do you explain that? It's an environmental change. The shape of the skull, the colors of the eyes, the other physiological features are possible. These variations are possible within a kind. Leminam. The Torah makes an emphasis that all the animals, the fish, the birds, they were all created within their min, their species, their kind. And they stuck to their kind. For example, since we're talking about kinds and species right now, it is possible to have many kinds of dogs. I mean, it's a fact, just see. Dogs you can interbreed them even and get different kinds. You can even get a half a wolf and a half a German Shepherd. It's all within the kind, approximately. But you're not, from a dog, can you get a cat? It's a completely different set of DNA. The DNA has already determined more or less, what you're going to have and what the possibilities are. There's some flexibility, but not these major changes from one kind to another kind. So the first problem we have is that no missing link has been found in the fossil records anywhere that shows that this species all of a sudden grew eyes that it didn't have before, grew a leg, grew a tail. And by the way, why would it need to? There's a joke that they say about evolutionists, that they believe that everything became gradual. So they ask, what came first, the mouth or the stomach? If there's a stomach, it doesn't make sense, because you first need a place to put the food. You need a mouth. Did the mouth come first? Where would it store the food if there's no stomach? Or did the rectum come first? If there was no rectum, this organism would have constipation for many years. Doesn't it make sense that the rectum, that the mouth and the stomach were there from the very beginning? Otherwise, how do you explain it? It could be really funny. But these die-hard believers don't care about how funny it is. They still want to believe, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. So missing link, there's no missing link. There's nothing in the fossil record that proves that anything was intermediary in between two species. Next problem, the next weakness is that no organism that is so simple, like a cell, a primitive cell, can become, through mutations, something so extraordinary, complex as a human being. It's not possible. Statistically, mathematically, no matter how you look at it, it's improbable. The odds are against something like this happening. If you ask them, well, what do you do with the odds and statistics? Don't you know statistics? Math is math. You can figure it out. They say, well, with time, everything is possible. All you need is billions of years. You see, if you believe in a young Earth, like you guys do, then of course in 5,000, 6,000 years it's not possible. But we believe the world is 14 billion years old. You give it enough time, anything is possible. That's what they'll tell you. They have an answer to almost everything. Anyway, as a result of this problem of major changes, as I mentioned before, they had to talk about or introduce mutations, because the mutations is what really helps them try to bring about these major changes that would not be possible otherwise. But as far as mutations is concerned, you should know mutations are usually harmful. And if anything, this would not make it evolve into something better. If anything, it would die off because of the mutation that happened. Mutation can only explain, at the most, or I should say survival of the fittest, can only explain survival within its kind. Survival of the fittest cannot explain how it evolved. That has nothing to do with how one evolves. Surviving just means that it survived. It could explain how it survived despite the problems that it encountered. It has nothing to do with evolving. They claim that this is reason enough for it to evolve, but that has nothing to do with evolving. It just explains that it survived. Anyway, Darwin, by the way, himself said that he had, I told you before, he had some problems with it, he had some doubts. He himself said that if anybody can find an organism, an animal, a creature, that could not have evolved by itself because it's so complex? Just one. If anybody can find that, that would of course destroy his theory. And that is why he himself admitted that the organ that gives him the biggest trouble is the eye. The eye is so complex that he says he doesn't know how to deal with it. It gave him a lot of trouble. It gave his theory a lot of problems. The eye was complex. Back then they knew how complex the eye was. If he were to be alive today and he was honest and he would take a powerful microscope and see the complexity of every cell, the machinery, the mechanisms within a simple cell, he would see that this cannot be by itself. In other words, science, if anything, I've always claimed that scientists should be the first ones to be chozer b'tshuva. They should be the first ones to admit sheyesh Elokim la'olam, because they see it up close through powerful microscopes. They see it more than anybody else. If they told the world everything that they see, there wouldn't be any atheists. But they're in the business of not sharing that information, those wonders. They want to cover it up. And it is a real cover-up. They won't tell you everything they see. But they on a day-to-day basis, they see the wonders of Hashem much more than the average individual. Okay, then we have another weakness with the theory, that life is so complex and so interdependent. Everything is so interdependent with each other that it's impossible that all of creation, right, should be able to form just by itself. And we see a certain dependence, an interdependence of all organisms in all the organs within the body. It appears to us, or to any person who uses logic and is honest, that everything is by design. There's a need for anything. You can't get rid of a certain part of the body. They really think, some really think today that we don't need an appendix. But they thought so about the tonsils too, and they've eventually discovered that there's a need for tonsils. They don't remove your tonsils automatically today. There's a need for everything. Kadosh Baruch Hu did not create just vestige organs, extra organs, just like that. There's a need for everything in the human body. There's a need for everything in creation. There's a tremendous interdependence of everything. Yes?
If that's the case, why would there be a need for males to be born a certain way, so we would have to have a Brit Milah?
That is the question of why Hashem required the Brit Milah, and He should have just created man without the Orlah, right? But we spoke about that in the past. Part of the answer to that, part of the explanation is to show man that he's imperfect. There's something for him to do to perfect himself during his life, during his stay in this world. So by removing the Orlah, which is of course the Jews' job and the Ishmaelites too, he's reminded that he's to perfect himself, that he was born imperfect. He's not like another animal that comes into this world and within a couple hours is walking on its own, feeding itself. Even though there are some that are feeding themselves right away, a human being is so dependent on his parents. He's not even crawling, does not even have teeth. It takes time for him to develop until he becomes mature, until his mind evolves. And so that by removing the Orlah, he's reminded that he was born in a state of imperfection, and it's his job to perfect himself. That's the basic explanation for the Brit Milah, for removing the Orlah. Hashem, of course, through the Brit, has another idea in mind for us, for the Jews. It's a covenant that we enter, an agreement that we enter. But why to that part of the body? And what is the symbolism behind removing the Orlah? Is what I just said. It has to do with perfecting oneself. This is what we do throughout our life. Working on ourselves, refining our character, and becoming more spiritual. That is the message or the symbolism behind removing the Orlah. So anyway, this weakness basically points out that nothing as complex as the universe, where everything is so interdependent with each other, could have possibly happened by itself. Things just, it doesn't make sense, because we can clearly see the design and the need for certain things to be where they are. And one of the most interesting questions you can ask a evolutionists, is okay. Everything started by itself. There was a Big Bang. Well, how did the Big Bang come about? Where did the first organism come from? Everything came from one simple cell. Where did that cell come from? Nobody in this field of evolution has an answer to that. Even Darwin himself said, the origin of the first organism is the greatest mystery of all. So they have a problem, no matter what they say, Big Bang, Schmig Bang, no matter what they say, how it all evolved. How did the first organism come about? Who brought that? Nothing happens just from a vacuum. Where did that come from? That we don't know. That you don't know, then why don't you just say you don't know anything about everything else? Why do you have to make a claim that you understand how the world was created when you don't know where the origin of the first organism comes from? Anyway, as a result of the problems and the weaknesses with evolution, you should know that some evolutionists have admitted that you cannot explain the development of the human being, Homo sapiens at least, unless you introduce God. In other words, some of them already have admitted that it's impossible to explain everything. They still believe in evolution as a form of development, of gradual development of organisms and species perhaps, but they say the complexity, the human being, after all, the human being is in a whole different category in itself. You have to introduce some divine entity here. So some of them at least admit it. Some of them, of course, just the opposite. They say, well, human being? What's the big deal about a human being? He's 99% like a chimpanzee. And you know what? They're right. If you look at the DNA, if you start taking it apart biologically, the looks, of course, are a little bit different, but biologically, they're very, very similar. But is that all? First of all, they forget about the neshama, which they can't see or prove. The neshama. And the fact that a human being, despite all the similarities of an ape, is nevertheless so different that he has the ability to speak and to reason and everything else that an ape doesn't have. So the 99% is irrelevant, because what we are seeing is a completely different creature over here. That's again without knowing that there is a neshama. So all this anatomy, all these similarities really are irrelevant. Now the fourth weakness is as far as the various pieces or fragments that they have found all over the world to prove their theory. I must remind you, in case you ever confront somebody who believes in evolution, is that there is very little evidence, because all that they have found is small fragments that by themselves, fragments of anything, do not prove anything. It's really not so consistent, it's not so clear, it's not so evident that what they're talking about is anything close to what they're saying. You know, there's a lot of they claim evidence, but if you look closely at their evidence, it's inconclusive. It's not clear. But they will point you, they will give you a list of things that have been found here. So using their evidence, the evidence itself is weak, because there is no clear evidence. It's inconclusive. You can't prove anything from it. And as the example I gave you before, many times there were even hoaxes. A hoax that they tried to show something. Anybody read the news about a week ago or two? They made a big deal from a dolphin that they found off the coast of Japan, I think, that had some extra set of legs. They were not legs, but they were fins. Now somehow it was growing another set of fins. And so you see, this is proof that it once was walking on land. It had legs. That is proof. I mean, but they'll use anything. And all what they've used, all the evidence, is really fragments, and it's inconclusive. You can't base your whole theory just on that. A lot of the skulls that they found and that they claim were human. See, human beings were originally apes. When they further investigated it, they found out that these were really apes that became extinct. They weren't humans. You know, if you just gave it a little bit more investigation, more effort to figure it out, they realized that it wasn't human. It did not walk on 2 feet. How come we don't see that skull? Well, because it was a monkey that became extinct. Animals have become extinct. When we speak about dinosaurs, we'll talk about this point too. How things can become extinct. And the fifth weakness is what I started mentioning before about the geological strata. If you want to have an idea, I highly recommend that you go to the La Brea Tarpis Museum. There's a nice amount of bones and fossils there of animals that have become extinct that used to live in this area. Mammoth, saber-toothed tiger. They have their own theory in that museum how they all came together and drowned because of the tar that got stuck there. But we have, of course, a different theory of how many fossils got scattered all over the world, and that is through the Mabul, through the main big flood during Noah's time, which scattered a lot of animals, killed a lot of animals, and a lot of bones have been scattered everywhere. And it's only through the Mabul, by the way, or through a tremendous force of nature, that you have a fossil. Because think about it, if an animal dies, it decays. And with time, if the scavengers did not eat it up, with time even the bones will fall apart. Even bones don't last forever. So how do you find an intact mammoth? How do you find a fossil? Either preserved through ice, like in Siberia, or through tremendous pressure of the Mabul, putting it down deep into the ground, and almost instantaneously. With that pressure, you don't have the amount of time to make it fall apart. And you have fossils. As the Mabul produced, I have no doubt, tremendous amount of fossils all over the world. That is why you will find fish up there in the Malibu Mountains. What are fish doing there? Yeah, because the water level got up there. There's a lot of information that shows that there was a Mabul. A lot of information, scientific information, if you have an open mind. And if you believe in the Mabul, once you believe in the Mabul, it explains a lot of things. Because when you look at the geological strata, what is the weakness? The weakness of this strata is that they claim dinosaurs came before human beings. Then why are some human beings found below dinosaurs? As an example, if they came before, then the dinosaurs should be at the bottom, the human beings should be on top. But they sometimes found the other way around. They found them together, they found them the other way around, they found them one on top where it should have been at the bottom. They found all sorts of things that didn't make sense. And guess what? They're hiding it from you. They don't want you to know about these things. Because it disproves. And what's wrong with disproving a theory? Why don't you just admit it? No, we've already made up our mind. And therefore anything that is inconsistent we won't accept. So when they found human footprints next to a dinosaur's in a riverbed in Texas, you know what they said? Somebody came in the middle of the night and chiseled the human footprint next to the dinosaurs. Why? Because it can't be. We've already decided it can't be. It can't be. Then how are you going to convince these people? They've already made up their mind. You see where they're coming from? So what is the problem of these evolutionists? Let's spend the next few minutes just trying to figure out their mentality. There are some who've admitted that they've never been objective, that their methodology was not scientific, that they haven't found enough evidence. There are some. But the vast majority, what they have in common is, you know why they don't want to leave evolution and believe in anything else? Because what did we say a couple of weeks ago? There's only two alternatives. It's either Big Bang evolution by itself or creation. They don't like the alternative. That is why. That is what they all have in common, is they don't simply like the alternative. So they have to embrace this. They have to believe in this. The alternative would mean believing in God, in creation. They don't want to. That's what they all have in common. Some say, well, creation is something so unbelievable and fantastic. Wait a minute. And a Big Bang is not? A Big Bang producing all of this spontaneously? Out of nothing? That is not incredible? That is not fantastic? Why believe one more than the other? And by the way, doesn't it make more sense that there is a design? And if there's a design, there is a designer or an architect? No, it doesn't make more sense. Why? I mean, it's logical. It's common sense. I mean, just ask anybody. by the way, why would you not say that? Why would you not say that on an airplane? You ask any scientist, unless he's crazy, was this Boeing jet, did this happen by itself? Of course not. It was designed, it was built. Then why don't you have a problem believing that the plane was designed, but when it comes to the human being in the world, which is much, much more complex, with that all of a sudden you have a problem that could not, it happened by itself? How could you believe here it happened by itself and here not? Why? Why is this so obvious and this not so obvious? It's only because they don't like the alternative. But that's not the only problem. The psychology of kofrim, of atheists, is as follows. The rabbis talk about the psychology of atheists. Nobody leaves religion because he investigated it and he found it not to be true, or he had a problem with it. On the contrary, anybody who investigates religion will become a Baal Tshuva. Anybody who has left religion, or anybody who has not embraced religion, Judaism, it's only because his retzonot v'ta'avot mafriot lo. His desires and his wishes are in conflict with religion. And the grandson, I think, of Huxley, who was called the pit bull of Darwin, the main follower, the guy who mainly spread the news, the grandson, I think, wrote a booklet, Confession of an Atheist, where I don't remember his exact word, but he basically said, I did not want anybody interfering with my sexual desires. Those were his words, approximately. I did not want anybody telling me what to do and how to live my life. I did not like the idea of having morals. So, he spells it out very clearly, that it's the ta'avot, it's the retzonot, one's wishes that conflict with believing in a God. A kofer, an atheist, is not logical. As it's brought down, the rabbis tell us that no atheist, there was never a true atheist in history. A true kofer, a true atheist who really believed in, he simply does not want to hear the truth. He tells you he's willing to investigate it, but he's not really interested. You ask anybody who's an atheist to come to a seminar and challenge the lecturer, and they'll tell you the same thing, I don't have time. They'll come up with some other excuse. Is he fair? Is he honest? Is he logical? Of course not. There are no true atheists. They simply don't want to. As I've said before, rabbis tell us the truth is something very, very heavy, and that is why there are few people who are willing to subscribe to it, to carry it. It's too heavy. It means commitment, it means responsibility. And as you can tell from the reaction to all these proof and evidence, no, this is not evidence. It can't be true because it goes against evolution. It can't be true because it goes against evolution. It's become a religion for them. And Rabbi Elyahu and Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman also have a ma'amar, an article about this phenomenon, that they simply do not want to accept the truth. As Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman says, the truth is something very clear, something that one can easily come to. As long as he's not a fool, or as long as he's not meshuhad, as long as he's not bribed. In other words, what happens is that the mind is being bribed by the ta'avot, by one's desires, one's ritzonot. But he says very clearly, if one is not bribed, then one has the ability to understand the truth, to know the truth. But the ta'avot blinds one from seeing the truth, even though it's so clear and so logical. Rabbi of Kotsk said something beautiful. He went into the Bet Midrash where his students were learning, and he asked everybody, where is Hashem? And they said, what do you mean where is Hashem? Hashem is everywhere. Malek kol haaretz kevodo. He said, no, you don't understand. Hashem is wherever you let Him in. There's a lot of people out there that don't want to let in Hashem into their life, so they keep Him out. They are the evolutionists. But it's not only the evolutionists, it's all the people who may have been observant at one time and have decided, lachzor b'sheira, as we call it in Hebrew, they've turned away from it because of doubts. Do they really have doubts and questions? No. The doubts and the questions came later on. You know what came before the doubts and questions? No. It could be a mashber, it could be depression, it could be some problem in the home, in the family. It could be a child who wants to rebel against the norms and against everything that he believes in. Rebellious child that just wants to rebel. Or one has tremendous amount of yitzarim, or ta'avot, desires that are controlling his mind, that are so powerful. So he lets go, and later on, down the road, he becomes a philosopher. And he tries to justify, so he can have a clear conscience of what he's doing. After all, that is the explanation of why a Mesitu Mediach wants to seduce another Jew, mislead another Jew. Just be happy, just be quiet, just mind your own business. You believe in this cult? Keep it to yourself. Why are you trying to become a missionary? There are Jews who try to be missionaries and convince others, because that is their way of living with the fact, that they deep down you should know, every atheist knows the truth. It's not that they just try to get away with it. They know it, but they try to justify and rationalize with it. Otherwise, they really have a hard time living with it. So there are people who have turned away. They were observant only because they are suffering something emotionally at home, something that they're rebelling against, something that bothers them, or their ta'avot, which many times is a problem, that in order to be able to allow yourself all these desires, then how are you going to live with it if there's a God? No. They remove that from their life and they can live with it. So a lot of the evolutionists today, that is what they share in common. It is an open rebellion against religion and that establishment, as we said before, brought about by the scientific revolution and brought about by the advances in geology. And all of these factors together, strengthened this theory, but nevertheless, it is full of weaknesses. As you can see, scientifically, it doesn't add up to anything. But even if we ignore the science, it's not logical, and the only real explanation, or one of the explanations, that they don't want to let go of it, is because there's only one alternative, which is very uncomfortable for them, and that is creation. I'd like to finish with an expression that you find in Chazal, in the Gemara, a very funny expression, or an ability, that there are some rabbis who are very sharp, who have the ability letaher et hasheretz. They have the ability to find an insect pure. An insect has impurity, has tumah. And the Gemara says in Masechet Sanhedrin that one of the conditions for being on the body of the Sanhedrin, you have to be a smart man, you have to be knowledgeable in Torah. You have to know witchcraft. Witchcraft, yeah. Because if you're dealing with a witch, you have to know how to defeat the witch. You have to be able to recognize witchcraft, because witchcraft is asur. It's prohibited. So you have to know what is and what is not. They have to be experts in witchcraft. They had to know languages, because they had to understand the person who was talking. They had to have various abilities. And one of the abilities there that is very strange is that they had to have the ability, the acumen, can we call it the mental acumen, to be able letaher et hasheretz, to take something which is taref, to take a cheeseburger, right? Cheeseburger is taref, you can't have cheese with meat. To take it and to logically convince you, explain to you why it's kosher. Can anybody do that? Take a cheeseburger and convince me that it's kosher? That is what letaher et hasheretz means. They had to have the ability, they had to be so smart as to show you a way where it can be kosher. That takes a lot of brains, but it's possible. Because there was one rabbi who was able to show you in 150 ways how something is not unclean, but it's tahor. But it's an insect. 150 ways. So my question was, why is that a condition for being in the Sanhedrin? The simple reason for that, the simple explanation for that, is because a judge has to be able to see all the possibilities of the case. Even if it's so obvious that he is guilty, a good judge has to be able to see the remote possibility of how this man may be still innocent, nevertheless. In other words, you can't be blinded to just be one-sided. So perhaps the simple interpretation of L'Taharet HaSheretz means it's a continuation of that logic. You have to be able to see all the sides, even the most extreme. But perhaps the explanation is as follows. I thought of another idea. Anybody sitting at the body of the Sanhedrin had to sometimes make important decisions, very important decisions. What are you dealing with? You're dealing with testimony, you're dealing with witnesses. You know there's a lot of liars out there? A bunch of liars, fakers. Not everybody's Shlomo HaMelech, who has tremendous wisdom, who was able to tell who the true mother was, right? Remember the story? You need a tremendous chokhmah, you need help from Hashem. You can't, all the judge sees, Ella Dayan Ella Mashenav wrote only what his eyes could see. He can't see everything, he can't know everything. He's going based on witnesses, documents. How could you tell? Comes along the rabbis and tell us, you know what? A judge also has to be able to find a sheretz tahor. Why? He has to have the ability of being able to figure out all the tricks, anything that anybody can come up with, to take something which is totally false, a lie, a hoax, and see through it. That is the ability of L'Taheret HaSheretz. Take something which is so obviously impure and unclean and make it clean. In other words, they have to have the ability to disprove, to figure out any tarmit, any trick that anybody can think of. They're trying to deceive the judge. They're trying to mislead somebody with the wrong ideas. That is a tremendous ability. And the Torah tells us that unfortunately out there's a lot of people who deceive themselves. And how do you deceive yourself? Lo taturu achrei levavchem. We always understand what it means, Lo taturu achrei levavchem v'achrei einechem. Be careful, don't let your eyes wander because they will mislead you. It's not all that the eye sees. Be careful with your eyes. The eyes are very powerful. That we understand because the eye sees and the heart craves and the body commits a sin, chaz v'shalom. But what does it mean, Lo taturu achrei levavchem? Your heart? The simple meaning means curiosity. That one is curious. Because you don't look at something unless you're first curious. It first starts with the heart, then it goes to the eyes. But Lo taturu achrei levavchem, the rabbis tell us, has another meaning. Be very careful with minut, with apikorsut. Apikorsut resides in the heart. It's strange and foreign ideas to Judaism. Kfirah, heresy. That is what levavchem means. Be very careful with all this heresy, with all these philosophies that they can mislead you. They can twist your thinking. Lo taturu achrei levavchem. You can easily fall for it. And that is why the Sanhedrin had to have that ability to see through people's mind, what they're thinking, what they're trying to do to mislead people. We had groups in Jewish history like the Tzdukim and the Baitusim that had their own ideas, and it was all because of politics. They didn't want to accept the authority of the rabbis. There were Jews throughout history that had their own way of thinking that was contrary to our tradition because of some agenda that they had. Be very careful if you are biased. If you are here, if you have some personal agenda that is going to blind you, it's going to blind your logic. Because if you do not allow you to blind yourself, guess what? If you do not allow you to blind yourself, if you're honest, seeking the truth, you will find the truth. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given every human being the tools to discover Him. Why does He want us to discover Him? Because that's His will. And that's a very important point. That no matter how much you argue with these people, and some of them are very, very smart, they'll give you an excuse for everything you say. They'll try to defend what they say. And some of them, again, I'm warning you, some of them are very, very smart. You'll be able to see, if you're very careful, you'll be able to see through their tarmit, through their trick, that they're not completely honest, they're not completely objective. Why not? Because they're not searching for the truth. And of course, it doesn't therefore help to argue with them, because if one is not searching for the truth, there's no use for arguing with them because they've already made up their mind. A person who has an open mind has not made up his mind. He's willing to hear if he's made a mistake. He's willing to start all over again and throw away the theories. They're not willing to do that. Now, most of them are not willing to do that. They're not willing to throw out the theory. They'd rather throw out the evidence that's against them than throw out their theory. What does that show? That they're not seeking the truth. Baruch Hashem, Am Yisrael has the Torah, has the Emet HaYechidah, and there's only one truth. There can't be two truths. Nevertheless, we are told that our emunah should become stronger through yedi'ah, through understanding and knowing that Hashem created the world. It's not enough to just believe it. We can find out. We can prove it to ourselves. We can look around at creation, because the signature of Hashem is all over creation.